Welcome everyone to VSBA's webinar on the report of the task force on the implementation of the Pupil Weighting Factors Report. The report was issued on December 17th, and the legislative committees have started to review it and discuss it. There's a lot of information in the report, and we're going to delve into it today. We hope you're going to come away with a better understanding of the issues, the decision points in the report, the legislature's plans for moving forward, and also how you can provide input. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, please type your issue into the chat box, or you can call Carrie Lamb at 802-477-3601. That's 802-477-3601. We welcome your questions. Please type them in the chat box, and I'm going to be monitoring that. Our panelists today are Representative Emilie Kornheiser, who's the co-chair of the task force, Brad James, who's the finance manager for the Agency of Education, and Dr. Tammy Kolbe, who is an associate professor at UVM and co-author of the Pupil Weighting Factors Report. They have all contributed a significant amount of time and work on this topic, and we thank them very much for joining us today. We're going to start with Representative Kornheiser, who's going to give an overview of the report and the decision points within it, and then we'll move on to questions after that. We're going to reserve at least 45 minutes for questions, so please get your questions ready. The webinar will conclude at 1:30. And with that, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Representative Kornheiser, who has a presentation that she'll be sharing on her screen.
Thanks, Sue. I'm really glad to be here with everyone today and have a chance to share with you the recommendations, the fairly extensive recommendations in our final report. I am going to be screen sharing, and so if things are happening in the chat box as I'm going, Sue, I would really appreciate if I need to be interrupted, if you would just interrupt me with your voice, because there's only so many flashing lights I can focus on at one time. Thank you.
I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, and I'm gonna be sort of blasting through this presentation. Last time I gave it, it took an hour, and so I'm hoping to narrow it down to much less than that today. And you sent some of your questions in advance, and I believe that many of them are going to be answered through the presentation, and then we'll spend time afterwards, as Sue said, answering some more of them. So with that, I'm going to now attempt to share my screen, and we'll see how that part goes. Did I succeed? Fantastic. See, it's a good Monday after all, everyone. So I am Representative Emilie Kornheiser. I co-chair the Pupil Weighting Task Force this summer and fall with Senator Hardy. Through the task force, we were staffed by JFO, significantly by AOE in the hands of Brad James, and with our joint fiscal office, it's really significant staffing from Ledge Council as well. We had 12 official meetings. They were all full day meetings. At the end of every single meeting, we had time for public comment, as well as 2 full public hearings. We heard from more than 50 witnesses, had more than 70 public comments, and really spent significant time at the beginning, making sure we had a foundational and historic understanding of Vermont school finance system. It was very important to us that we made policy decisions based on analysis and data and what is best for Vermont's children, not on what has been described as the printout wars. I'll talk to you about that a little more later. And we maintained very close communication with Professor Kolbe and some of the other Pupil Weighting Factors Report authors. We were driven and focused on really being as curious as possible about the particularities of Vermont's very special education finance system, and a desire among all of us to create the best possible system for our kids and for our schools. We worked really incredibly collegially as a task force and with our staff across party and quite collaboratively, and we had unanimous approval of our final report. The final report came with 2 specific recommendations for systemic change of our education finance system. Option 1 was pupil weighting, as is, in our task force title. And that was to apply a general set of school level pupil weights, all applied at district level using an additive mathematical function. I will tell you what that means later, to students living in poverty for middle and high school students, with small schools, which have fewer than 250 or fewer than 100 students that are in sparse school districts, and a weight for sparse school districts with population density below 155 or 36 persons per square mile. We also had a separate set of recommendations, sort of choose your own adventure for our legislative colleagues, called cost equity payments. And that was adopting a general set of cost equity payments derived from the cost equivalents, which are in the pupil weighting study, and asked our colleagues and Professor Kolbe's team and our joint fiscal office to conduct further analysis to determine the appropriate payment amounts and the impacts on school districts. But those cost equity payments would be using and adjusting for the same factors, that is, students living in poverty, middle and high school students, small schools, and sparse school districts. Sorry, my little scrolly wheel is being a little touchy today. So we asked our colleagues to essentially choose from one of those 2 options. And I don't know if you can still see my face with my screen sharing, but I'm making a little V with my hands. And once the legislature, once the education finance system goes down one of those tracks, regardless of that track, we ask both paths to then unite again for these further recommendations, if that makes sense to you. So these recommendations apply to either path, either cost equity or the pupil weights that we might choose from. And that was a categorical aid program for English language learners designed to benefit all schools with English language learning students and eliminate that pupil weight. We recommend changes to the way we count students living in poverty. We would recommend that we eliminate the small schools grants and replace it with weights while maintaining the merger support grants for both districts that merged voluntarily and didn't. We recommend a series of different transition mechanisms to ensure that all districts can meet the needs of their students going forward and experience as little disruption as possible. We recommend the creation of an education tax advisory committee that would both oversee any ongoing updates to the weights or the cost equity payments, and do that through a consensus process between JFO and AOE so we can maintain consistency, change our work, change our approach regularly, and do that in a way that is creates as little disruption as possible. We recommended a comprehensive evaluation mechanism in order to ask if any of these changes that we implement do in fact improve student outcomes and equity of opportunity in our schools. And we recommend moving to a unified income-based taxation system for K-12 education funding, eliminating homestead property taxes for education and replacing them with a unified local income tax system. Additional recommendations, as if that was not enough, were to continue to monitor the implementation of Act 173 special education block grants, to significantly focus on our education quality standards process, oversight, and supports, to have property tax credits correspond with current year tax bills rather than previous year tax bills, to monitor Act 45, which is a childcare financing study, in order to have a conversation in the future about appropriate weights for pre-kindergarten students, and to focus on the Act 72 school facilities study work, because we know that is also a significant cost driver for schools. To have a conversation around a fractional weight, possibly for early college, and to talk about the disincentives built into the CTE system, and to explore the creation of student mental health and trauma-informed instruction grants. So that is a lot of recommendations. And I'm realizing that I skipped a slide up here. There it is. The reason that we had all of those recommendations is we had an incredibly broad charge ahead of us, including weighting calculations and values, but also considering Acts 60, 68, and 46, considering equity, considering education quality standards, consider poverty, really quite a broad mandate. So going back to my sensitive little scrolly wheel, and to step back for a minute, because that's what we did as a task force, was we talked about the background of our school funding system. So we know that the Brigham decision led to Acts 60 and 68, which was a strong and successful focus on taxpayer equity and created one of the most equitable funding systems, financing systems really in the country. But it did not accommodate, and the Brigham decision, if you read it again, which I actually recommend, it's quite delightful reading, did not, Brad laughs every single time he hears me say this, the Brigham decision did not actually address the issue of the different costs of educating students. It talked about the different tax capacity of communities. And so this work that we're doing is really a next step from all of the work of Act 60 and 68 to talk about the different cost of different student need. We talked about the state education fund and how a statewide shared fund has multiple revenue sources that is essentially self-balancing. We must have an emphasis on the strong local control of our school spending decisions, and that school boards, you all, and local voters determine our school district budgets. We talked about how right now we have a combination of pupil weights, our equalized pupil numbers, and categorical aid to address student needs. And that the complexity and collectivity of our system enhances equity right now, but it also creates confusion, so much confusion. And it means that any changes, of even small ones, deliver massive ripple effects that impact every school district and taxpayer in the state. And that since Acts 60 and 68, Acts 46 school governance changes, the expansion of educational opportunities, including universal pre-K, curricular pathways, and special education changes, all also altered the school finance landscape in Vermont. Oh, this scrolly wheel's the worst today. Okay, so these two paths that we recommended. One is the weights. If we are going to continue the use of pupil weights in our schools, these are the weights that we should be using. They are not from the study, if you've been following all this closely, they're different numbers than in the original study from Professor Kolbe's team. They are from a memo that was dated 10/28/21 that took into account our moving from a measurement of poverty that was based on the number of food stamps, that the food stamp enrollment in a district, and moves to using free and reduced lunch as a measure of poverty. It also takes us from a combination multiplicative and additive formula for calculating pupil weights, and to adjust additive formula. It is super in the weeds to explain why we did that. I'm not going to do it today, but that's why we have these different numbers in front of us. The other thing that is also worth noting is because we moved to a combination multiplicative additive formula to an additive formula, we wound up going from, in some cases, a base of 1 and some cases a base of 0 to everything being at a base of 0. And so if you look at these numbers, it looks, for instance, like the secondary grades enrollment values, the weight actually went down, but in fact it went up. It's sort of the equivalent of 1.39 because of the change of a base of 1 a base to 0. Super in the weeds, but as you're comparing one to the other, I don't want you to get confused by that change in base. The numbers do the same thing. So we are looking now at a poverty weight of 1.03. We're looking at middle grade enrollment of 0.36, secondary of 0.39, and then all of these other weights that you can see on the screen. I'm not going to read them to you. What I want to highlight here, and I'll talk about a little bit more later, is that the weight for enrollment in a small school is only applied if that small school exists in a district that is going to get the sparsity or the population density weight. And that's actually a really fun mathematical weight to get to this fairly abstract idea of a geographically necessary school. So that is one set of weight recommendations. Alternatively, we are recommending a cost equity payment. Both the updated weights and the cost equity model are empirically derived and based on the same cost factors that were presented in the UVM report. Each idea has pros and cons, and both ideas require additional modeling of impacts. There are many challenges that apply to both the weights and the cost equity payments, and the task force has done its best to resolve or identify many of those. Using the weights has the benefit of maintaining a system that's familiar to school districts. But if we're going to continue a system with a weighted tax capacity, we must move to this new empirically derived weights. But the weights also have really significant drawbacks. These drawbacks were true before we looked at these new weights. The distortions that the weights cause in our system all exist under current law, but under the proposed new weights, which are much heavier or more significant, these magnifications or distortions are much stronger. And we have a chance right now to discuss them, because we don't want to create an almost equitable system and bake in problems that we could have avoided. So adjusted weights don't guarantee that the additional funds will be approved by voters or that funds will be spent on the area of need. As explained, pupil weights impact a district's tax capacity, not its spending. The use of weights has a magnifying impact. It benefits higher spending districts more than lower spending districts. And weights are applied to our student populations. And then those weights are mixed in the same statewide pot, the equalized pupil calculation that you all know about. And for me, that's one of the most confusing aspects of our system, because it means that really strong poverty in one area could sort of outweigh the need in another district. And from my perspective, if we're finally going to take the time to name that we have these significant cost drivers and needs in different districts, we need to do our best to actually meet those needs once we've declared them. And so we have this other proposal, which is essentially for every single student living in poverty in any district in the state, that district would get payment of $10,664 for every one of those students living in poverty. Similarly, for every student enrolled in secondary grades, they would get $4,038. These numbers are actually estimated placeholders, and we're going to update them with a forthcoming memo from Professor Kolbe's team. But that's the basic idea of the cost equity payments. Those payments would come at the same time that you would receive other categorical grants to your district, but they can be spent however you see fit. They're designed to offset the cost, the increased costs of these particular student populations that you're educating. And then whatever difference in your voted budget between your cost equity payments and all of your other grants, that then becomes your education spending, and that's what your tax rate is based on. Obviously, you're going to all have more questions about this. When I'm done, I'm just going to try to run through all of it the best we can. So, as I said, pupil weights shift school district tax capacity, not school district spending or resource allocation. That is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's just really, really important to name if our goal is student equity or equity of opportunity. So what the levers we have in front of us in either of these conversations, cost equity or pupil weights, are levers that are about increasing or decreasing tax capacity in districts, not increasing or decreasing spending in districts. And that everything we do is driven by this model of local control that we have in Vermont. So, pupil weighting pros and cons. These might not necessarily be my pros and cons. They might not necessarily be your pros and cons. I think a lot of things in the con could go in pro, a lot of things in pro could be in con, but this is a way to frame the conversation. It is far from perfect. It's the best I have for you right now. We could just talk about factors in the pupil weighting approach, I guess, too, but that might be even more confusing because we use factors to mean other things. So pupil weights maintains our current system, and while it is confusing, it is familiar. It might be dynamic to differential budget needs of local school districts. Like I said, it counts, a weight sort of counts for more in a higher spending district. It adjusts for inflation more easily because it's essentially sort of a percentage. It maintains local control of spending priorities and decisions. However, it does not guarantee that additional funds will be approved by voters or spent on the area of need. As I said, it magnifies impact, benefiting higher spending districts. Different weights The differential weights for areas of need means that larger weights sometimes offset the impact of smaller weights across and between districts. Equalized pupil calculations are confusing to voters, they're confusing to legislators, they're confusing to everyone. And increasing the pupil weights may increase overall education spending. Cost equity payments have some similar pros and cons. Pros are it delivers payments to districts that reflect accurately the per pupil cost for different categories of need. It still maintains the ability for districts to spend additional funding as desired and has tremendous flexibility in how those cost equity payments are spent. It simplifies the formula by eliminating equalized pupil calculations, which means we will just talk about average daily membership now, which is almost like talking about kids. It's not exactly the same as kids, but the numbers are very, very close to the number of actually children you have in your school system. It improves transparency. But some cons, the tax impact of the transition is actually a little more extreme for school districts under the cost equity approach. And someday we can talk about why. So they both have very similar impacts on school districts. If we model out the impacts, the curves of implementing the new pupil weights or implementing the cost equity approach, the curves look really, really similar. But districts that would gain tax capacity under cost equity or pupil weights might gain a little bit more under cost equity, and the reverse as well. And so the impacts are a little spikier, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. For cost equity, there's some unknown unknowns. It's new. And so there might be some cons or pros that we're just not aware of yet and need further research. It's not sensitive to different local budgets. It will need either regular recalibration or inflation adjustments. But as you'll learn, pupil weights also require regular recalibration. And again, this might also increase overall education spending. Task force also recommended a categorical aid program for English language learners. We know that more and more school districts in our state have students requiring ELL services. It's currently concentrated in a few districts with a large number of students, but we have a growing number of districts with a small number of English language learning students. The per pupil ELL spending right now is highly variable across the state. And we are concerned that not all English language learners in the state have the capacity to get their needs met. Their school districts don't right now have the capacity to meet their needs. We are not able to ensure that with the weights that additional funding is spent on a specific area of need. And a categorical aid program does that. Because if we're going to have a statewide commitment to equitable education for all English language learners, which we have both a federal obligation to do and a moral obligation, we want to guarantee that the funds that are there when students need them, that the capacity is there when students need it, and take out some of the difficult local discussions that you all might be having about race, culture, and immigration. We also recommended a change in how we measure poverty, moving from SNAP enrollment, which is current law and is outside of school district control, that's something that the Agency of Human Services does, to free and reduced lunch price enrollment, because that is available data available in every district right now and more accurate. And then beginning the process of moving to a universal income declaration form, which many districts now use, but not everyone uses. All three of these systems set poverty at 185% of the federal poverty level. And so it's not a change in what poverty is, it's just a change in how we measure it. We would be moving to a program, to a way of measuring with the universal income form that schools have a great degree of control of administering. And actually the universal income declaration form, schools are allowed to require families to fill this out, whereas that is not true of free and reduced lunch price forms. Is across the board a more accurate measure of student need, because it takes away both a lot of shame and stigma and a lot of the struggle that families have in actually just logistics of enrollment. We also recommended moving from a small school grant to weights for small schools. And small schools are measured at 2 different levels. And then rurality is measured at 3 different levels. And these are the cutoff points that where they saw a different effect in the pupil weighting study. And Professor Kolbe can explain those cutoffs to you if anyone is curious when we're done. However, we recommend that we maintain the merger support grants for both districts that merge through a community vote or districts that merge through the State Board of Education order. And no one can get both. Excuse me. Hidden in our findings, just kidding, is a pretty massive overhaul of how we actually calculate our education property taxes. And that is moving to an entirely income-based system. So right now, 70% of Vermonters qualify for an adjustment to their homestead property tax because of their income level. And only 30% of Vermonters pay their homestead property taxes entirely on the property value of their primary residences. We are recommending that we move to an entirely income-based system for this. We are interested in doing this because it will continue to move us into a conversation where we talk about all of Vermont's children and not district to district differences. I see that Brad's hand is up. Do you want to jump in, Brad?
I was just going to point out you actually accidentally skipped the slide where you had the transition mechanisms that led into this one, just so you know.
Thanks. I'll go back to that. I appreciate it. I don't really know what's happening with my scrolly window. I had some screen sharing problem earlier. I appreciate the technical support. I will go back.
That's what I'm here for.
Ah, here we go. So important. And particularly, I think, important to all of you who are here today. So we need to make a change. There's an urgent need to make a change. We have declared and announced and admitted that the weights we've been using for a long time are really not based on much of anything. And so we need to move forward with changes that account for the differing cost of student needs. However, we know that every school district across the state is experiencing massive instability right now. And we want to make sure that anything we do is not going to further destabilize anything happening in your districts. And so want to ensure that any transition mechanisms we put in place are set up so that everyone can continue to meet their student needs in a consistent, reliable way into the future. So we've talked about ways of mitigating tax rates by phasing this work in over 5 years and using education fund surplus as a cushion. We would like to set things up so that no one's tax rate changes either up or down by more than 5% a year, that models are built on that assumption. We talked about suspending both the excess spending threshold and hold harmless provisions during the full transition period, but being very clear that we would be putting them back in place at the end of the transition. We're hoping to move the property tax credit to the current year in order for any transition in tax rates, especially in wealthier towns with lower income Vermonters living in them, for those folks to be protected. And to really pay very close attention to statewide school spending through this transition. And again, as I said, moving to a fully income-based education tax, which previews the slide that I already went through. So onwards. In further findings, and I am sorry about this slide, everyone, but we didn't weigh in on Act 173 implementation and the special education block grant. What we chose to not make any recommendations. It was really beyond the scope of our task force's capacity. And since it hasn't even been implemented yet, it was unclear whether or not what is recommended will work or not. I know that that is the transition to that block grant is an area of very high stress for a lot of districts. And I really encourage you to continue communication with the Agency of Education and with our House and Senate education committees about any of your concerns about that. And if people have questions about the special education block grant and thoughts on it, Brad and Tammy are both available and have lots of thoughts about both of those things, I think. So I think this answers one of the questions that was asked in advance, but we really want to make sure that if we do all of this work, it's going to make a difference for kids and for communities. And so are building in a pretty robust evaluation mechanism to ask whether any changes we make had the desired outcome of improving equity, simplicity, and accountability for our schools. We want to look beyond test scores to make sure that we are looking at kids' wellness and well-being as well as a broad range of educational outcomes. We want to know if our goal has been met, and if not, why, and we want to know how much it costs to be doing all of this work. And there are even further issues that need covering, because this is a really complex system with all those interconnected sort of butterfly parts, like I said at the beginning. We want to make sure that pre-kindergarten weight is addressed and that it's part of the massive childcare financing study that's going to happen next summer. We want to understand better the impact of announced tuitions and different ways of tuitioning and how they address both statewide spending and the calculation of or delivery of weights or cost equity payments. Really need to understand school facilities and construction and find a way of funding that separate from just our regular budgeting process. Look at fractional weights for early college and CTE to make sure we don't have disincentives in our system for students to enroll in these two really fantastic tracks. And look at the cost of student mental health and trauma and make sure that we're addressing that in our schools. So, I'm doing great on time. This is exciting. I'm sorry for my fast talking. I hope that works for people's brains. You have the presentation. I believe Sue's going to send the presentation out to folks if she hasn't already. And so you can have it for your very own. So conclusions, we need further analysis on both the updated weights and the cost equity payment amounts. And we have that further analysis coming shortly. We need to complete modeling with those updated numbers. That should be fairly quick because the modeling is already built about the impacts that has on districts, but we also need to add in CLA adjustments and model out the income-based education tax model. And that is actually all very close to being finished now, which is very exciting. And the Senate Finance Committee is going to be taking that up shortly. We are dividing the components among different committees of jurisdiction. All of these recommendations are not going to move in one terrible big omnibus bill. It's going to be divided up into probably like 11 different pieces of legislation that are going to be in 4 different committees. So for instance, the English language learning categorical aid program is going to start in the Senate Education Committee because it is a grant, and that's where grants around sort of educational needs sit in the education committees. But the conversation about pupil weights versus cost equity is going to start in the Senate Finance Committee, and the conversation around an income-based education funding formula is also going to start in the Senate Finance Committee. So we need to monitor the work, continue to monitor the work of the other study groups that are all just starting to have some of their findings coming out. The facilities report is forthcoming, the implementation of the new special education programs, et cetera. We want to ensure that the agency, and I don't want this to be buried in the next steps here, we need to ensure that the Agency of Education has sufficient resources to support schools in these critical times. And I think this is particularly poignant given given the Secretary's announcement on Friday. It becomes very clear that our schools do not necessarily have the sufficient resources that they need from AOE to be doing some of the work that they need to be doing. But the education quality standards is a really great example of that, but English language learning is too. We really want Agency of Education to be a partner and a thought leader with our schools so they don't need to reinvent the wheel. We want to work to improve equity outside of our school system. We know that over the last 20 years, many of the costs of poverty and of student struggle and of families' experiences have been put on our schools. And they don't need to all sit on our schools. Schools are just sort of the last stop in some cases, and they can't handle all of it alone. And so how can we think about the drivers of educational outcomes that occur outside of our school systems and make sure we're investing in those too? And as we do all of this work, we need to continue to be hyper conscious of the fatigue and stress on all of you, on your schools, on your school personnel, on students, on families, on legislators, on legislative staff, on UVM faculty, on agency staff, on everyone. These are really hard times to be doing much of anything, and even more hard times to be doing the really hard, dynamic, stressful, contentious work that we're doing here. And so I really hope we can be kind to each other through it all. And remember that we really all want great schools for our kids. So the last thing that I just want to share is again about this idea of Brigham, and that Brigham took us very, very far to make sure that tax rates, that spending in one district matches tax rates in another, right? That we really moved beyond the incredible challenges we have around property taxes and community capacity and community wealth from district to district with Brigham. But we did not think about what it actually costs to educate these different students, and that this is the next step before us, is to be thinking about that. But the lens on all of that is that and one of the really powerful lessons of Brigham that I think that Vermont carries in its heart, along with local control, is that these are all of our kids. And we all need to think about what it means for our state and for our communities and for each other if we really invest in each other's education. And so with that, I will stop my screen sharing and thank you all for bearing with me through those 30 minutes.
Thank you very much, Representative Kornheiser. Is there anything, before we get to the questions, is there anything that you would like to add, Brad James or Dr. Kolbe?
Not from me. I think Representative Kornheiser covered it quite well, and you know, I think what I will add will probably come in terms of questions that people are going to be asking.
Okay, I have
likewise from me. I think Representative Kornheiser covered the landscape pretty well. I don't have anything to add. I'm happy to answer questions though.
Wonderful, thank you. I have several questions that were submitted ahead of time. I think a few of them were answered in your presentation, Representative Kornheiser, but I'm going to start with a few that have been submitted today, and then I'll go back to the ones that I got before. So the first one I have from today is one of the arguments we've heard against the reverse foundation formula, the so-called cost equity formula, is that by assigning dollar figures to students, it becomes much easier for those pushing for vouchers to make their case. We've heard you don't believe this argument holds water and that you don't believe this could happen in Vermont. Given how we now know that the "it can't happen here" argument has more holes than Swiss cheese, please discuss this concern that many have and why you don't believe it holds water.
And I'll chime in here. I see my name invoked in the comment. I haven't said that the reverse foundation formula would lead to vouchers. The grant amounts in and of themselves are average per pupil costs derived from, ultimately we will be providing our numbers, but the numbers they have right now should be conceptualized as the average per pupil cost for a particular sort of cost factor. Could it be that someone adds those all up and says that this is the value of a particular child in a certain location? Yes, that could be the case. And could that be used to try to make arguments around vouchers? That could. I have not made that argument. I just want to be clear on that. And I want to be clear what those numbers are. Representative Kornheiser, do you have something you want to add?
Thanks for that intro. I agree. I think we already have a lot of numbers on the table well before this conversation about how much it sort of costs to educate a kid in Vermont. We already have, you know, tuition, average announced tuitions that name how much it costs to educate a kid. We already have a really pretty significant voucher system in Vermont in a lot of parts of the state. And so the policy tools, to my mind, that would prevent us from moving to a statewide tuition system or a statewide voucher system are policy tools that lay outside of this. And I think anyone who wants to do that is going to find more than enough fuel in our existing education finance system. I'm not concerned about adding a little more fodder to it. I think that where that fight takes place is with a different set of policy tools. And I'm happy to another time get into those other policy tools. I really believe very strongly in our public schools, and I want us to continue to invest in them.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question, which is, with free and reduced lunch numbers quite inaccurate given universal meals, both before COVID and now continuing, And with the fact that districts with greater resources have the ability to mail applications independent from other documents and have staff make calls to encourage and assist parents, why would you go to free and reduced lunch and not wait until you have a universal income form, which the state can mandate, where the state is forbidden from mandating free and reduced lunch by the feds?
I love that question because this is, for some reason, one of my favorite little details of our work, maybe because it's so tangible. Even with all of those problems, free and reduced lunch numbers are still better than SNAP numbers. And we have significant research from the Hunger Council and the Hunger Council's partners, as well as Professor Kolbe's team, that it is a better measure of poverty. It is also not a perfect measure of poverty. It's far from a perfect measure of poverty. And the schools that are have universal lunch, in most cases, are already using a universal income declaration form. Brattleboro is, Burlington is, I think Montpelier is, a few other towns are. What we also, so we basically just want to do a little bit better for 5 years or so, because we can't move immediately to a universal income declaration form because the weights wouldn't be accurate anymore. And so we need to use the weights that are set to free and reduced lunch for a period of time, moving to better, while we roll in the universal income declaration form, and then would need to recalibrate the weights based on the universal income declaration form at the end point. And so we don't want to wait all that time for the universal income declaration form before we move to better. And so we're going to go from better to best. And in whichever case it is, however soon it happens, the universal income declaration form needs to be significantly simplified. The ones that are using right now are much too complicated. And so we want to make sure we make them as simple as possible so that districts have as little administrative burden as possible in sending them out and in having families fill them out, because we're all very aware of exactly what you just described, which is that districts with more capacity to, chase down and encourage families to fill out forms are districts that might have higher numbers, and we don't want that kind of geographic disparity.
Okay, next one is, as we consider accountability measures to determine if this shift is impacting outcomes for students, do we have an expectation of how these measures would apply to students who are being tuitioned to independent schools? No. But it's a great question, and it's definitely part of what the education committees are going to need to figure out. The State Board of Education was doing significant work this fall around education quality standards. It's one of the reasons that we didn't have many recommendations related to them, because we didn't want to get ahead of that work. And it certainly needs to be part of the puzzle. Professor Kolbe, do you have anything to add on that?
No, other than I do know the state board will be opening up the EQS standards this spring and summer. And I would expect that these kinds of questions will be taken up in the context of that discussion. But our existing school funding system, whether it's equalized pupil or sort of the cost equity proposal, does not include explicit links to accountability mechanisms or outcomes right now. Nor do other states have those explicit links. This is a really tricky issue, right? Because there's been no real evidence to suggest that any kind of performance-based funding system is particularly effective in K-12 or even higher ed. And with that can create another set of equity concerns. So I have not heard anything that has come out of the task force or the legislature suggesting that there would be that explicit link between dollars and outcomes. That said, I do think I heard, and Emilie, chime in here, that there was general concern on the part of the task force and certainly the General Assembly last session in really wanting to strengthen the EQS around accountability and outcomes for students, and in ways that would ensure that we had equal educational opportunity across all schools in the state. Agreed.
Thank you. I'm going to move to some of the questions that were submitted ahead of time, and then I'll come back to some of the live questions. One of the ones that came in ahead of time was, with the cost equity proposal, won't the state be on the hook for providing funding for the actual cost of ameliorating the increased needs associated with poverty, ELL, and sparsity? How will that work?
I love this question. before, and I see Brad wanting to, I'm going to get philosophical for a second, Brad, if that's okay with you.
By all
The
means.
state's already on the hook. That's what the Brigham decision says. It's that it is the state's responsibility to equitably educate all of its students. And we then devolve that, and that's sort of a technical public policy term. We devolve that responsibility to the districts, who then sometimes devolve it to other schools, whether tuitioned or not. However, we are always on the hook for it at the state level, and that we have a statewide education fund for that very reason, so that we can hold that responsibility no matter how we deliver those funds to districts, whether it is the exact amount of money that they ask for through the system we have now, or whether it's a combination system that we might move to with the cost equity proposal.
Right, that's pretty much what I was going to say, except not quite as eloquently. The state is already on the hook, is really what it boils down to. We're you know, it's a statewide system. What you think of as a local property tax are actually state monies that you're paying in. So it's all being paid for the way it sounds. I think maybe what's kind of precipitating the question is the understanding that tax rates are going to go down across the board, or not tax rates, pardon me, spending per pupil is going to go down across the board if you have the cost equity model put into place, because those are kind of offsetting revenues that would lower what we consider education spending. All things being equal, assuming that we have the cost equity model happening where people are getting their payments coming in, then yes, spending per pupil will decrease, which means that we still have to raise the same amount of money in the ed fund. So that means that the property yield, instead of being up here, is going to drop. And so the tax rates are going to be roughly in the same area where they are now. So you're going to still bring in the same amount of money. That's essentially what's going to happen. Spending per pupil will decrease, the yield will decrease, and the tax rates will be therefore higher to bring in the right amount of money. I kind of think that's part of what was also being asked at the time.
The other thing that I would add about all of that is that while in both models, the state is absolutely explicitly on the hook for equitable education funding, under the cost equity model, our delivery of that responsibility becomes slightly more explicit to districts. And I actually think that might be helpful in having community conversations around these issues, because I think it makes our responsibility more explicit. And I think when responsibilities are implicit, they become more difficult to talk about with voters.
Here's another one related to that topic, which is what cost containment measures work with the cost equity proposal? And actually there's a follow-up one too. I apologize for sending you two at once, but I can repeat the second one after it. It's how will cost equity, cost containment measures be applied to ensure equitable opportunity for all students? So the first one is what cost containment measures work with your cost equity proposal?
Essentially the same cost containment measures, because you still have education spending, you know, like education spending meaning the technical term education spending. And you still have tax rates that are based on that education spending. And we still would likely have an excess spending threshold. We can talk about if other mechanisms need to be built in. Has been sort of some background talk around the cost equity payments being tied to some sort of ratio, but I think that actually might complicate things way more than is useful to anyone. And so essentially we have the exact same cost containment system set up in either model. Professor Kolbe, you have a thoughtful look, but maybe you're thinking, I don't know. Jump in if you would like.
I will say this, and I am not trying to disagree with Representative Kornheiser, but I think there is one important caveat to put around the cost equity or sort of the reverse foundation formula amounts, right? And that they're average costs. And if we think about the fact that we're going to have a distribute, right? Their average means it's the middle point of a distribution. And so those payments for some districts will be too high. And for some districts, they will be too low. And that is one of the trade-offs with this particular approach, right? Which is for some districts, there will be more money than they may actually need. And for some districts, it may be the case that there is less money than they actually need. What that does for cost containment is hard to say, but I do think that that's one thing we just have to remember here, that these are average. And with the average means that we have people or districts or schools on either end of the distribution for whom those payments will not be exactly right. So how that fits into cost containment is hard to say, right? Because we've not done this before, and it's hard to model out things that we don't exactly know what sort of behavior will be. But it is the case that for some districts in the state, those payments will be too much money, right? And so it could incentivize additional spending that may not have been incentivized previously. Again, I think that's an important trade-off just to put out there, and to remember that when those numbers come out, they are the average.
Thank you. For continuing along that line, can you explain the advantages and disadvantages of correcting the weights versus working to develop a whole new funding mechanism?
I think I did that in the presentation. I could spend like another 4 hours on it, but I think that that was as summative as I can get without the 4 hours. That's what I did in the presentation.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll jump in by saying, Sue, that both the weights and the categorical program that are being proposed are viable policy options. But as Representative Kornheiser pointed out, and the task force report points out, there are trade-offs with both these options. The one thing I would say is that I think we know the trade-offs a little better on the equalized pupil calculation, because we have experience with that. A little harder to know exactly what the trade-offs are with respect to the cost equity or the reverse foundation formula, because we haven't done that, right? And so we can look to other places. There are examples like California and New York who have done these sort of kinds of categorical grant schemes. And, there are some trade-offs that come with that. And I think this is really going to be at the heart of the discussion that's before the General Assembly, is sifting and sorting between these trade-offs and trying to think about on what policy objectives are we trying to optimize, because the reality is it's going to be really difficult to optimize on all of them at the same time. So I think Representative Kornheiser did a pretty good job in her slides laying out a bunch of the trade-offs, or at least the ones that we might anticipate going into this conversation. But I think certainly part of the conversation will need to be lots of stakeholders chiming in on other kinds of trade-offs maybe we haven't even thought about, or their thoughts on how this might play out, right? Especially on the cost equity side or the reverse foundation formula side, because we haven't done that. And so I'm seeing Representative Kornheiser nod along with me. I think it would be really great to hear from school boards and districts and others about how they think this might impact them and their decision making, and sort of what this would do for equity from their perspective.
I really appreciate that, because I think thus far a lot of the conversation has been just sort of, concerned that we veered off in a new direction. And I think the more folks can get their head around, what if this did happen? What would that look like? And what are some sort of thoughts, accommodations, potentialities that you see attached to that? We had 2 different recommendations because we knew that the cost equity model was too soon and too new to fully flesh out. And there are a lot of unknowns. What I would also add is that until the task force met, there had not, to my knowledge, been a public conversation about if weights are actually the appropriate model for delivering equity in our particular school finance system. And so that sort of broader question is one that we needed to answer in the course of our task force work, and was not actually within the purview of Professor Kolbe's report. Her report was about answering the question, if we are going to use weights, if we decide it's the very best mechanism, what should the weights be? But those are 2 very different questions. And we really had to, in our responsibility as legislators, answer the question of, are the weights actually the right mechanism at all? Because no one had asked that in the last 20 years publicly yet.
Also, the weights were largely a carryover from the foundation formula that we had before. And so I agree with Representative Kornheiser. She's framed this out. I think we have to think about the fact that there wasn't a lot of discussion around the weights when they were rolled over. We know that the weights we have now are legacies at best and other things at worst. And the real question is, you know, what do we graft on to our existing system that's going to improve equity in the state? And I think there's a lot of room for discussion there, you know, and again, there are pros and cons with both of these approaches. And the real trick, I think, or task before the General Assembly at this point is sifting and sorting through those and input onto what those pros and cons might be from a school board perspective, I think is really important, right? Because a lot of this is just trying to think that through.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to go back to some of the live questions. The next one is, why move small schools from grant funding, but decide to move ELL to grant funding? If more money is needed for cost equity, unless the state can sustain the increase, wouldn't adjusting weights that distribute resources be more equitable? It was stated that free and reduced lunch is available, accurate data, yet our school district has done universal meals for several years and families do not fill out the paperwork, which concerns me with the accuracy and how the data would be validated.
Colby, did you want to start this one off, or did I misread your message to me?
That was earlier, but
Okay.
I think the question is really trying to get at a policy decision, which I'm going to defer back to the task force on with respect to a categorical grant program for ELL. I think what I can say to that question in sort of an objective way is, out of our report, we did do a lot of investigation around the small school grant program and found pretty unanimous agreement, which is very hard in school funding generally in Vermont, that no one particularly thought it was operating very well for lots of reasons. And so in our recommendations, we incorporated it as a cost factor that would be accounted for in a weighting system. And again, as Representative Kornheiser just said, you know, we were asking just to consider the weights. And so we created a weight that would address both school size and sparsity. And I'm also seeing a question here, I don't know who Sharon Ellingwood may have put up with regard to sparsity. And I think what's important to know in our analysis is that we were able to partition out the difference between the additional costs with school size or economies of scale and the additional costs that come with operating schools in small geographically remote areas. And that was defined by population density. Why population density? Because it's the best measure that's available. And that one where we could apply it uniformly across the state, and we drew on census data to do that. The benefit of using census data is it allows us, one, again, it's uniform across the state, and two, it will allow that measure to be updated with updates to census data as they come out. So I hope that answers also that other question. But the policy question around ELL as categorical versus, I'm going to pass that back to the policymaker.
I was super surprised when I thought you did want to start with that one. I will answer the question. The reason we are recommending that we move ELL to a grant funding program is because we have a legal, federal, and moral obligation to ensure that students with English language learning needs are educated in a very particular and full, robust way across districts, between districts, throughout Vermont. And from what we can see so far now in spending, we know that that's not happening because we believe that many districts don't have the capacity to do that. But there are also other reasons why districts might not be doing that. We want to make sure that throughout the state, this group of students who are often a protected class are getting those educational needs met.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the numbers associated with that, because those have not been finalized yet, right?
Yep. The numbers associated with that grant have not been finalized yet at all. That's why there's actually no bill floating around that you could have looked at yet either. And so the construct will be that every district gets a flat amount, which is sort of the equivalent of like a part-time teacher. And then for every additional English language learning student, they would receive another lump sum amount for that student. So it would be census-based. It would be paid sort of in the same year or the back year. It wouldn't be a reimbursement model. It would be sort of proactive for the number of students. You would be counting your English language learning students in the exact same way you would say count your English language learning students for the purpose of getting a weight on them. They need to be counted regardless. And so that would be how the grant would be figured. The actual amount for the per pupil amount in that grant is pending a memo from Professor Kolbe's team that we are looking forward to receiving that will that delivers sort of those cost equivalency amounts that we talked about a little bit earlier.
Okay, I'm going to move on to another.
We'll have it very soon.
Sorry.
The memo will be there very soon.
And you are working very hard. I did not in any way mean that to sound even slightly pushy. We are all doing more than
no
we can.
no pushiness. I'm just letting everyone know that it's imminent.
Thank you, Dr. Kolbe. I'm going to move on to another question in the chat, which is, I am wondering whether there is a way to capture poverty other than qualifying for free and reduced lunch. I live in a district where the majority of our students attend independent schools, and some of these schools do not offer lunch to their students. Could families nevertheless qualify for free and reduced lunch and included in a district's poverty count, even if a given school doesn't offer lunch?
So we looked at like a bajillion different ways to measure poverty. And I think people have been looking at how to measure poverty since long before I was born. And there's a really pretty incredibly robust and fascinating set of literature around that. We are not, because Vermont is so darn tiny, census data doesn't work for us at all. It works in a lot of other states for doing this. It doesn't work here. We can't use tax data because of privacy concerns. And so we're really, at the end of the day, left with sort of the choices that you've already heard before you. It is absolutely, yes, possible to have schools, whether or not they serve lunch, have kids fill out free and reduced lunch paperwork. And I would hope they were actually doing that already, because counting those students those student counts inform a whole lot of other pieces of existing Vermont policy above and beyond the weights, and actually inform how much money we get from the feds on certain issues. And so even if none of this work ever happens, it's really, really important that every district has very accurate free and reduced lunch counts having nothing to do with anything I'm working on.
Here's a related one. How do you suggest we actually enforce mandatory income declaration? I can't see ejecting a student because their parent refuses to submit the paperwork.
No, of course not. There's a pile of ideas about it. We are recommending that a working group get together that's made up of practitioners like front desk staff and folks from the Hunger Council and Agency of Education staff to really work through both a form that's simple enough that families would be willing to fill it out, to make sure that it is available on, say, smartphone apps as well as mailable forms, that it's simple enough. We're hopeful that a lot of the stigma that's attached to free and reduced lunch forms won't be attached to universal income declaration forms, because everyone fills them out, and that will help. But all I mean by required is that you say to families, this is required. I'm not imagining any enforcement mechanisms. And there's all the same things you might use for attendance. So like, if 20 out of 23 kids in this class get their forms in, then we can have a whatever thing. Everyone knows how to incentivize things in a school. There are lots of fun tools to do it, and we would sort of put together a menu of those to support you.
Thank you. Here's one about moving to income-based tax. It says, how will the town tax the individual Vermonters instead of using the grand list?
So there are a bunch of different modes of moving to an income-based formula that have floated around policy circles since Act 60 and maybe before. The most recent build out of that idea is in the recent Tax Structure Commission's report, the Blue Ribbon Tax Structure Commission's report. I would recommend looking there to learn more about this if you can. The idea likely would be that anyone with a homestead is paying their is paying their school taxes based on their income, rather than that it's, and that would sort of hold renters harmless and would hold, keep non-homestead taxes still in the same function that it's in right now. But there are lots of other ways to do it. And that will be worked through in the committees of jurisdiction.
Hey, next I have a question about rurality. Can you describe the factors that went into determining the different measures of rurality? It seems like many Vermont districts have small schools that won't meet these criteria. So how did the task force go about conceptually identifying some small schools that would be prioritized over others?
I was thinking this was yours, Professor Kolbe, but maybe it's not.
Yeah, I didn't know. They referenced the task force. For our study, we did two things. One, we looked at school size, and that was in terms of enrollment, averaged over 2 years. And we also looked at population density, which is persons per square mile. We carefully modeled to figure out at what point a school was small enough to incur additional costs that were due to economies of scale. And the same thing for at what point was a local community sparsely populated enough that the schools incurred additional costs. In both instances, the idea is that the economies of scale of operating a small school and operating a small school in a geographically sparse area are factors outside of schools' control. So we developed weights to go with both of those things. Those cut points, and I think that might be what you're referring to, were statistically modeled to figure out exactly where the inflection points are for differences in costs when we look across the entire continuum of enrollment in the state. For Vermont, there actually are a large number of small schools. And so we had, I think the question also here is like, how could we do that? There aren't enough small schools. There actually are quite a few small schools in Vermont, and we had a lot of years of data to look at that. So the estimates were quite stable for that. What we did then look at, and this is a recommendation in our report, is that the small schools weight be combined with the sparsity weight. Why is that? And this was in response to feedback that we got through interviews and focus groups and input from stakeholder groups such as PSBEA about the fact that the small schools grant as it is unwinds certain provisions in Act 46, that the two things work against each other. And so if the intent is for the state to provide equal educational opportunities for geographically necessary small schools, and there are geographically necessary small schools in the state, then we should include weights for those or some sort of reverse foundation formula, a categorical grant for those. But at the same time, we want to be careful not to do something that is working against the hard work that districts are currently doing around school consolidation under Act 46. I'll kick it back to you. Did that? I know there was some reference to the task force there and its deliberations on that. So maybe you can share out there.
No, I think we heard from witnesses who are engaged in the efforts to figure out what a geographically necessary small school was from a policy perspective, and appreciated what an impossible task that was before the school board when it was the State Board of Ed, when it was the State Board of Ed's job to figure it out. And so really appreciated the mathematical certainty that Professor Kolbe's team offered in terms of where the cut points were for effect in cost. And so that really is what guided our work as we moved towards the weights and the particular way that the weights would be applied.
Thank you. Here's another one. The object of the effort was to assure adequate funding of all students and avoid printout wars. Examining the impact of particular options requires analyses of this sort, yet every presentation to the task force seemed to have a winners, losers analysis, Many people questioned whether the report reflected bringing home the bacon. How did you and the committee ensure that the work focused on the needs of children rather than political or special interest needs?
I really appreciate all of the metaphors that were in all the questions that were submitted in advance. We have like bringing home the bacon, there's something about a milkshake and something about brigadoon. And I just like, thank you for adding a little color to my life. I love when people reference the printout wars because I imagine staff running around with these like reams of dot matrix printer paper that are like flowing behind them and like hustling from room to room as legislators yell at each other, which we don't really actually do very often. It's very compelling. The first thing that we did to avoid the printout wars, which we genuinely wanted to avoid, and anyone who reached out in advance to warn us about the printout wars, I super appreciate that, was to really begin our work without any modeling finished. We were really, really careful. We spent so many meetings before we actually modeled any of the impacts of our work. And that made a lot of people super uncomfortable and sometimes mad. But we did it, one, to save some staff capacity, but really because we wanted to make policy decisions without each of us feeling compelled to look at our own district's bottom lines. And to really move, you know, that free and reduced lunch conversation was part of that. The additive multiplicative conversation was part of that. To move ELL to a categorical aid program was part of that. And so those were all policy decisions that we made before we actually modeled the impacts on individual districts. Because if you ever, Brad gave this really fun presentation about how the weights interact with each other that I recommend someone go look up in our archives. Because what becomes very clear once you start actually looking at the models is that a small tweak like that sends ripple effects across the whole system. And so we wanted to make sure we weren't making small tweaks in order to just like figure out who benefits. And so I was also really grateful. I'm from Windham County. And so Windham County alphabetically by county is at the bottom of the list. And so none of my districts were ever, it would have taken a lot of scrolling to ever get to my own district in a printout war. And so I tended to sort of, once we did start modeling, I looked at proxy districts that were sort of for me, like the canaries in the coal mine, like the district that I think of as like the most rural or the most poor or the sort of example of a wealthy high spending district. And I would sort of tend to go by that. But that's the bulk of ways we tried to avoid the printout wars. We also, whenever we talked about this work publicly, and we had a series of op-eds from members of the task force who really, really focused on this idea of all of Vermont's children, that we're all in this together, and that any changes we make are going to really be taking into account everyone's needs. And a lot of our mitigation mechanisms are really built around the idea that we don't want to create a new system of, you know, a lot of the language leading up to our work was about winners and losers. And we really want to make sure on the other side of this, we're not just like flipping a switch and making new ones. We really want to make sure that we're creating a system that meets all of Vermont's kids' needs.
Since you mentioned the milkshake question, I got to ask that one next. The milkshake blender formula. As a result of Act 46, strange combinations were formed, such as Roxbury, Montpelier. But this type of marrying very different towns can have misleading effects. It hides valuable information, reduces the variance, and exaggerates effects. Taking Lamoille South as a hypothetical example, a block grant in special education could overgenerate money in Stowe and undergenerate money in Morrisville. Thus, a lumpy distribution is smoothed over. Regardless of claims to the contrary, education takes place in buildings rather than SUs. What is being done or has been done to get accurate and valid unit of analysis?
So I have two sentences, and then I'm going to pass it to Professor Kolbe to explain units of analysis. So ideally, each district has a budget that they're working with, and then they're using that full budget to equalize cost and need across their schools. And so some schools in a district might cost more, and that would come out of the full district's budget, right? That's sort of the hope of Act 46. The study, which Professor Kolbe will explain more about in a second, measured at the school level in order to determine need. And so I think in the measurement that created the weights, you're going to save yourself the milkshake blender problem, which I'm now going to always call that. And I hope I teach a statistics class so I can use that phrase. But then once we count the students from all the schools and apply either the weights or the cost equity, the budgeting impacts are then applied at the district level, because that is the level that we budget at. So that's the level that we would equalize payments at, if that makes sense. And so we're working at both levels, both the level of budgeting and the level of measurement, to make sure that we account for both of those impacts. Professor Kolbe? And maybe Brad, who hasn't said anything.
I'm just going to jump in really quickly and say, and I mean, a lot of our, what were supervisory unions, but after Act 46 are now supervisory districts, single districts. Roxbury, Montpelier is one. Stowe, Lamoille, or Stowe, Morrisville, and Omar still are one. And so what's happened is these monies are going to the supervisory union, which in turn allocates them out. It's just like federal money. The federal money is going out to the we're paying it to the SU, and that's what we're doing with this. And then the SU is then allocating that money out to where they need to at the individual buildings.
And I think I'll just add, the last thing I'll add to all of that is that the current system of equalized pupils operates at the district level or the SU, right? And that our analysis was consistent with that. Again, our task was to think about how to recalibrate the weights to be applied to the existing equalized pupil calculation that's contained in statute, and that would be the district level. There was some question about school models. These are just different sources of data. And again, we talk about in our report, we modeled costs using school level data, district level data, and regional data. And the intent with that is to triangulate across the three sources to make sure, particularly in Vermont, with it, that we didn't have any something that was spurious or anomalous with regard to findings. And for the most part, our results are remarkably similar across the three models. The school level models using school level data were more precise, primarily because we have the most observations there, but also because it really gets down to the level where we could look at differences in student outcomes and the costs that schools were investing, the resources that schools were investing to achieve those outcomes. But the adjustments are all at the district level, and the results from the school level model are appropriate to be translated to a district level.
And Professor Kolbe, when you're talking about our report, you're talking about the report that you did that was issued in December of 2019.
That's correct. That's correct. We've done, right? So our report was the original, I've forgotten the title now, but something around pupil weighting study seems to be the term of art. As Representative Kornheiser noted, we did update some of our models for changes in assumptions that the task force asked us to consider, specifically moving to additive weights versus multiplicative weights, and also the change in poverty measurement. The primary two weights that were impacted by those two changes in assumptions were the poverty weight and the ELL weight, with the poverty weight going down and the ELL weight going up. I know there's been questions about why that might be. And that is really, I think we can think about that in terms of our current system of measuring poverty for the purposes of equalized pupils actually includes ELL in the count. So ELLs are counted twice. And so when we have to develop weights that have ELL in one part and ELL in another part, it makes the weights a little less clear as to what exactly the weight is measuring, right? So our former poverty measurement, well, our existing poverty measure would be former under the recommendations from the task force, again, includes ELL students in the count of students in poverty, and then we have ELL students over here. So when we remodeled those results using the task force's sort of request to use school lunch, FRPL, that basically decoupled the two in the models. And so now we have a very pure measure of ELL in terms of the additional costs of educating ELL students to common outcomes, and a very pure measure of the additional costs of educating economically disadvantaged students to common standards.
Thank you. Here's a more global question. How urgent do you think the need to fix the system is?
I think it's fairly urgent for two reasons. Though, if you spend enough time in legislative land, everything is very, very urgent, and nothing is urgent at all at once, and one's brain gets a little broken from it. So I don't necessarily always trust my own urgency meters, to be perfectly honest with you all. I don't know if I should admit that. It's urgent for two reasons. One, because we have significant surplus in the education fund right now, and we likely will next year as well, because of increased consumption taxes coming into the ed fund. And so because of that, we have money to, I don't want to say throw at the problem, but that's what I'm going to say. And so because we have extra money moving through the system right now, it will make it much easier for us to make any changes, because we can ease transitions more easily with that available funding. When Act 60 happens, there was also significant new money that was put towards the problem in order to sort of buffer transitions. The other reason it's urgent, which is much more existential and much less pragmatic, is that we've now named that we have this piece of state education finance policy that doesn't make any sense and should make sense, and that we have students whose needs aren't being accounted for in our funding formula, and they should be accounted for. And so we have districts that are, all of our districts are struggling. Some are struggling because of financial issues much more than others. And we need to do the very best we can to fix that now that we have definitive evidence that it happened, and that we have momentum to do something with that now. I'm going to throw in an answer to the last question that came in. Nope, second to last question, because it seems very appropriate in this moment, which is the biggest challenges for the legislature to take up these potential changes this year. And those are because everything is urgent right now. It's really hard to tell which can be more urgent. I will say that this is considered one of the higher priorities this session to get something done here. But we are working in this terribly messy hybrid zone. It makes coming to agreement really, really hard. It also makes looking at graphs and spreadsheets really, really hard. And I know that sounds like a tiny thing, but when you're rehauling the entire education finance system of the state, it's really important to make sure everyone's looking at the same numbers. And when we're all sitting at different computers, and some of us are only looking at iPads that are this big, it makes it really hard to know that everyone's making decisions based on the same information and coming from the same base understanding point. And so I'd say the biggest challenge to us getting something done this year is a combination of the legislature's not able to do its best work right now. We have some staffing challenges because everyone is in the middle of COVID and has childcare problems and life problems and all of the other things that everyone knows about. I don't need to tell you about it. And that it's kind of terrifying to me that we would do anything to even slightly destabilize even the smallest little corner bit of our school system right now, given everything else that's going on for all of you and all of us.
Sort of a related follow-up. And this is actually my question that came up in my head during this presentation. I'm really intrigued with your approach of having it be in 4 different committees and 11 different bills. And I'm just wondering how that's all going to stay coordinated for a cohesive result.
Well, I do have a spreadsheet about it in terms of coordination. So there's that. We have JFO staff, and that's sort of their job, is to keep all the balls or something, to hold it all in their hands. And then the other piece is, it's basically all going to sort of eventually, I think, wind up in House Ways and Means. It's just all starting in different places. Does that make sense, Sue? An ombuds bill, omnibus bill would need to do so much stopping and starting that I fear it would never get through. And this way the conversation can begin in a bunch of different places, but Ways and Means is going to be preparing for it throughout the whole session. We're spending half a day every week doing nothing but this, even though we don't have any bill in our hands.
And is that on a particular day of the week, at a particular time every week, like a standing meeting, or will that be moving around?
Right now, it looks like it's Thursdays from 9 to noon. If anyone wants to tune into the YouTube stream and have a really fun morning of it.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see, I think I'm probably not going to get to every single question because we're at 125, but I do note that both Representative Kornheiser and Dr. Kolbe have offered to answer any questions that we didn't have time to get to. And I'm sure that Brad, would you be happy to do that as well?
I would. I'm just not very good at using the chat function.
Okay,
that's all.
wonderful.
But
Thank you
yes.
so much. So let me see if I think we have time maybe for one more question. So I'll ask this one for ELL, why not use weight knowing it is equitable and then add a small grant on top of that to address the districts with small numbers of ELL students? Maybe schools that are underspending because they are underweight. EQS should be how districts are held accountable.
So I'd love if EQS was how districts were held accountable, or how I don't even know if I want to use the word accountable because it sounds a little punitive and I don't want it to be. I would love if EQS was the way that the Agency of Education knew which districts needed support and offered it then. But I think that's going to be a long journey we're going to be on to make that happen. And in the meantime, we have students who are English language learners right now who we want to make sure are receiving adequate, equitable resources to have their educational needs met. And so we want to make sure that's happening in every single district in the state. And that's what a categorical grant program is best for, is exactly this particular kind of need that I'm just described.
And just one more ELL, and I think then we'll finish. By choosing to segregate ELL funding from the rest of the formula and setting the amount at substantially less than empirical analysis says it should be, it appears the ELL proposal in the task force's final report results in discrimination against ELL students on the basis of national origin and language. Will there be review of the proposal from a legal perspective?
So the numbers in the final report are a placeholder, and we say that in the report a few times, but I think numbers as a placeholder are a terrible idea, and I swear to never ever do it again for as long as I live. We are going to have new numbers, which will be part of any legislation that is put on the wall related to this, that will come out of Professor Kolbe's team's cost equivalency data. And we're looking forward to those numbers. And so they will be empirically derived the same way the weights are empirically derived. I mean, slightly differently because they're different from the weights, but they will be empirically derived out of the same data set and some of the same statistical analysis. And the reason we have had legal opinions, multiple legal opinions, we actually have a joint legal opinion from our Legislative Council and Agency of Education's legal counsel that tell us that as as long as we are spending equitably and adequately, the actual mechanism for delivering that is not discriminatory, because the intent, and I don't think I can say this enough, the intent of the categorical aid program is to ensure that protected classes get their needs met, which we cannot do under the weights.
Thank you. We're right at 1:29. So we're going to wrap up the webinar. I would like to thank all of our panelists very much for being with us. It's been extremely helpful to hear all of this information from you. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. And also thank you very much for your offer to answer questions. And if it's okay with the three of you, we can provide, we do a follow-up email to everyone who participates in our webinars with the recording and any handouts. And if we could provide your email addresses in that email, we will do that. Thank you all very much.
Can I thank everyone, and also just offer, if me or Brad or Tammy don't respond to your email within the week even, that doesn't mean that we don't care very deeply about you and your needs. We just, all three of us have fairly full email addresses, and we promise, I'm going to promise on behalf of both of them too, we promise to get to it. It just might not be immediately, and we're sorry in advance.
And I will tell you, in my case, do not hesitate to remind me, because I will forget that there's so much going on. So feel free to remind me.
Same here. And I will also say to everyone on here, thank you to all of you for your service to the state right now. There's a lot going on. I know taking an hour and a half out of your time, out of your day is a lot. And this is an important issue. I hope you hear from all of us. But I don't know that all of you hear from other folks as much as you should. Also, thanks to you for all you're doing right now. I know this is a challenging time, and thank you for all you do.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kolbe. That's a great note to end our webinar on. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.